Good evening. Hi, everyone. I'm Pallab Ghosh. I'm one of the BBC science correspondents. The more observant of you will have noticed that I'm not David Willits. He sends his apologies. He's involved in business at the House of Lords. But welcome to everyone to an event hosted by the Foundation for Science and Technology. And for those of you here and to the audience on Zoom. The title for today's event is Black Scientists Tackling Racism in UK Science and Technology. And the Foundation is hugely grateful to Elsevier and the Royal Society of Chemistry for sponsoring this event and allowing this important discussion to happen. Racism is present in many areas of society, and unfortunately, science and technology is not immune. This evening, we'll be focusing on Black scientists and researchers and exploring a number of questions. What is the nature and scale of the problem? What is the lived experience of Black scientists in the UK? What actions are already being taken and what more needs to be done? After the speakers, we'll be taking questions from both in the room and over Zoom. For those of you following on Zoom, we'd like to ask you to use the Q&A function and not the chat. You can do this at any time, and there's no need to wait for the Q&A to start. You can also comment on other people's questions by upvoting them. And the way this works is the questions with the most votes will be passed on to the panel when it comes to question time. Now, the final point is that if you want to tweet about the event, please do, and use the hashtag FSTBlackScience. That's FSTBlackScience, one word. And so, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ale Palermo. Dr. Palermo is Head of Global Inclusion at the Royal Society of Chemistry, working on the priority areas such as equity, diversity, and inclusion in the chemical sciences and international large programs, developing inclusive global collaborations. In particular, this includes bespoke research to produce rich data and evidence calling out the inequalities that exist. And one of the brilliant things that the Royal Society of Chemistry did was produce a report called Missing Elements, which was a fantastic report. I'd urge you to search it on Google and read it if you haven't already, and maybe Ali will be touching on it in her talk. So Ali, please come to the podium.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much and good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and an honor to share the panel with my colleagues and a pleasure to share this with Elsevier, and thank you very much, Gavin, for inviting us to be here. So, let me just go. So there is plenty of evidence that racial and ethnic inequalities exist. And within that evidence, we know that Black and minority ethnic students face a number of barriers in higher education in the UK. And that means from access to education, to representation, to curriculum content, some people call it the colonization of the curricula, to the delivery of that content, and also the overall experience that they have at the university. And these barriers impact in many different ways students. In the awarding gap, we know that white students are more like 13% more likely to get a first or an upper second than Black and ethnic minority students. And this continues to PhD and postgraduate levels and even further into the academic career, with a consequent pay gap that we know that exists and fewer opportunities for research funding, for promotion, and also for the outcome of their research, the visibility of the outcome of their research as well. Overall, there is underrepresentation of UK students of ethnic minority backgrounds undertaking postdoctoral programs. And this has been addressed, for instance, recently by the Office for Students and Research England, providing £8 million to fund 13 projects to tackle inequalities to access postgraduate research. However, the impact of research, the research environment and culture on the progression of and the diversity of researchers is particular those who are identified as Black researchers, has been under the spotlight in many different ways. But within this context, there are not many direct activities that focus on those areas. And within this context as well, there is a burning issue has emerged really, and there is underrepresentation of Black scientists within the higher education research centers. And this is very acute in some disciplines more than in others. And what I would like to talk now is specifically about the chemical sciences, presenting some of the data and evidence that we collected, in particular in the Missing Elements report, as Pallab just mentioned. And I hope that by digging into one discipline, we can use chemistry as a case study to begin to understand some of the issues behind these inequalities. And this is the report that we launched in March, which really paints a stark picture of the realities experienced by those who are Black or minority ethnic in chemistry. And within this report, we really do not shy away from the discomfort of the realities experienced by some of the chemists. Like all our reports, is based on data and evidence. And this is a result of 2 years of research, and it's an extensive piece of research. We look at what happens in other disciplines, what is known. We use the available data for us, including chemistry-specific data from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, HESA, and our membership as well, and our data on our boards and our committees and so forth. We also consulted the community, and I think that was really important to define and put this into context, the data that we found. Through different various channels, we are trying to understand the lived experience of Black and ethnic minority scientists. And we talked to hundreds of people about what happens in different career stages, also beyond chemistry, and those who actually influence chemistry, like funders or policymakers. And we went beyond academia and industry sectors, including teachers, and beyond the UK as well. And our hope with this report was by presenting the data and evidence, there will be almost no more excuses to really start tackling the issues and address the inequalities that we observe. And this includes ourselves, the FRSC. So we are also committed ourselves to change. And there are also things that we are taking actions, and I can talk about that later on. So by analyzing the HESA data for 2019 to 2020, we obtained the ethnicity breakdown of students, and staff in chemistry. Sorry, let's move too quickly. As an indication of the progression of Black chemists and minority ethnic individuals within the pipeline. And for comparison, the dashed lines presented here show the ethnicity percentage in the UK population. And this is the previous census, but things do not change dramatically when we compare to England and Wales. This is for the UK, not England only. And the data show that there is a clear retention problem, which is particularly pronounced for Black people, Black chemists. And if you look at the orange bars, that's what it represents a Black chemist. So what it tells us is we are losing Black chemists at an alarming rate, really, in chemistry. And with those identified as Black making up only 4.9% of undergraduate students, and this is higher than the 3% in the demographics in the UK, but it's still low, which then drops fundamentally to 1.4% for PhDs and 1% for non-professorial, and then zero to chemistry professors. And I have to say, this is HESA data. So when numbers are below 5, they count as 0. So we know there is one professor in chemistry. There might be another one, but at least we have to report this as 0. And they might be not in chemistry departments, they associated, so HISA data, unless it's within the payroll, the chemistry department is not considered. And we see a similar trend looking at the FRSC membership. I didn't present a graph this, but, and this is important because we look at across our membership, how the seniorities according to the different membership categories, and we saw a terrible drop in terms of Black representation, Black chemist representation. And it's important to consider the membership data because represent chemists working in many different disciplines or sub-disciplines within chemistry, in industry sectors, in policy making, they are teachers, they are industry. So there is, and it's international. So it gives a complementary information than the HISA data. And it's clear then that we are losing Black people from the chemical sciences. That's the bottom line. And if we compare this with other STEM subjects, in particular with the Royal Society report, we look at that the attrition of people is observed at later stages, so after postgraduate level into academic employment. And in chemistry, we are losing chemists a bit earlier. And to understand this attrition a little bit further, we looked into where the undergraduate students are going, with type of institution. And it's compared to their peers. There is a smaller proportion of Black undergraduates at Russell Group institutions. Of all chemistry students, and I just want to very briefly say, for all chemistry students, 55% attend Russell Group University, but only 37% of them are Black chemists. Only 37% of the Black chemists go to Russell type of institutions. And we believe that this indicates a structural challenge. And as Russell Group institutions are more research intensive, they have more funding, the opportunities that students have by going to research to Russell type of institutions, they may have more opportunities to actually go into a PhD and so forth. But it's still the underrepresentation of them in Russell type of institutions is very important. And the sense of belonging that they can have as a PhD student as well in Russell institutions is very important. We also wanted to look at the effect of Black gender within the intersectionality between race and ethnicity and gender. And it's not surprising that there is a huge loss of all female chemists independently of the race and ethnicity. But when we look at Black women, it's much more pronounced than from any other ethnic group. For Black undergraduate students, there is a female majority of around 60% are women. And when we look at how those advance in their careers, obviously we, in terms of professor, 0. But when we look at other data, it really is very dramatic, the change and the loss of women. Finally, my last slide. I just wanted to mention a bit about the lived experience and what the information that give us and how complemented the data, the hard data that I just presented. We looked at all the lived experiences of hundreds of people from minority ethnic backgrounds working in chemistry globally. And this qualitative research indicated that there are 6 interactive themes that impact their attention in chemistry, which are mentioned here. And those are very similar to the ones that we observe for women. And we reported on breaking the barriers in the report that I just mentioned, showed before. So they are very similar, the barriers identified or the themes identified that are affecting Black chemists or ethnic minorities. But the depth of the issues is much bigger here. And why? Because it's a historical context behind racial discrimination that actually adds another really important complexity to the topics. And there are many, I don't know if I have more time to talk or no. So last point I want to make is everything is very similar to gender, the issues, but there's one opportunity, which is talking about the global community. And really is they need to integrate with the global research community and perhaps redefining what global role models means. And so I leave it there, but we can continue to talk about that.
Ali, sorry to cut you short, but I think this evening when we've got so many people with things to say and offer from the audience, it'd be nice to hear from them as well. So thank you for sticking to time. Just very briefly, I have met Robert McCoyer, the country's only Black chemistry professor. He finds it very funny that he doesn't exist in your statistics. What's not so funny is that although he's a leader in his field and has received many accolades, many grants from organisations like the Royal Society, he hasn't received a single grant from UKRI or the preceding bodies, which I think is shocking and suggests there is something wrong with the grant awarding system, and maybe we can get into that. Our next speaker is Professor Ijeoma Uchegbu. Ijeoma is UCL's Professor of Pharmaceutical Neuroscience, a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, a Governor on the Wellcome Board and Chief Scientific Officer of Nanomerics Limited, a UCL spin-out company. She serves as Chair of the Academy of Pharmaceutical Sciences and chaired EPSRC and Science Foundation Ireland grant prioritization panels. She is the immediate past UCL Provost's Envoy for Race Equality, a role in which she led on race equality work for UCL. Ijeoma, would you please come onto the platform?
Thanks very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and I'm conscious of time, so I'm sort of going to whiz through and talk to you slightly differently. I'm going to tell you why we should all care about diversity and inclusion, and I'm also going to tell you a little bit about what we've done at UCL. So first of all, I'll introduce myself and a little bit of what I do for my day job. I have this very, very interesting side hustle in diversity, but actually I'm a trained scientist and I do science all the time. So basically we have what we've called molecular envelope technology, which was developed in UK academia. We spun that out into a company, and this technology is all about creating medicines with reduced side effects and improved efficacy. And we've won some awards. The Royal Society of Chemistry gave us an award a few years ago. We work to create some drugs for pain, for allergic conjunctivitis, for retinal diseases, and also we convert drips into tablets. And we've out-licensed a number of assets to companies on the NASDAQ. We're working with Big Pharma and also working with Little Pharma. And we're running our own clinical trial at the moment. So that's sort of introducing me. Now I'm going to talk about why we should all care about diversity, because some people will wonder and think, well, should we care because it's a social justice issue, or should we care because actually it's good for society? I hope at the end, when I finish talking to you, you'll agree with me that it's good for everybody. So I'm not a diversity practitioner, so I rely on other people's data. And here's some data here, that if you have diverse management teams, they tend to be more innovative. And this is ESRC research. If you have diverse juries, they tend to be superior in their decision-making because they rely on the data. And I always give the example of when we're sitting around talking to people who we know very well in our families, and we can talk very, very authoritatively about the people on Strictly Come Dancing, the people we don't like. We don't have to provide any evidence, and it's fine to have that in a family situation. But when you're thinking about other people's lives, you rely on more on the evidence. And if you are very different from the people in the room, you scrutinize the evidence more. Ethnic minority, ethnically diverse teams, they price stocks more accurately. We've all seen what's been happening. I mean, I looked at I'm a member of the investment class at the moment. I mean, I used to be on benefits 30 years ago. So I think that's amazing. I looked at my portfolio in Fidelity, it's 20% down. It's not my fault, I haven't done anything, I just put my money there. But I just hope that I have a very diverse team pricing the stocks. And public companies, if you have an ethnically diverse board, they tend to be more profitable. There's lots and lots of data that's showing that actually if we have ethnic diversity and gender diversity in decision-making roles, we have better outcomes. And we're all worried about, some of us are academics here, I worry about my citations, even though I'm told they don't matter, but nevertheless, I put my H index there so that people know, how much I've written about. And if you work across geographical boundaries and you work across ethnicities, you tend to get more citations. That might be interesting. And if you live in an unequal society, such as the UK, where we have oligarchs storing their money in £12 million flats on the River Thames, and we have people in the north of our country unable to eat 3 meals a day without having to go and beg for food in a food bank, then you actually have more societal problems. So it's in our interest to get rid of these inequalities. And you may say, well, I'm at the top of the tree. I mean, I'm a middle-class woman. Why should I worry about people not eating? But actually, if I go out into the street and I'm clad in my fur and decked in my diamonds, and there's a beggar down the street, I immediately have a lot of anxiety, fright or flight. And so it is in my interest to make sure that I live in a society that is not as unequal as the USA or the UK, and maybe a little bit more like our Scandinavian cousins, because you have all these societal ills. And we know that we had a lot of deaths during COVID, and these deaths were more likely to be people who were poor, people who were Black, or people from Bangladeshi heritage. And as they died and the coffins piled up, we spent more time in our house on Zoom, even though we wanted to get out, and we had a longer lockdown. So it is in our interest to care about inequality. What's the reality? This is the reality. Ali has sort of told us a little bit about these numbers. But when you look at what's happening in UK academia, and we are talking about research, we can see that there's reasonably good participation from all ethnicities in UK academia. It's about 2% of UK academic staff are Black, about 4% with the recent census, about 4% of the UK population in England and Wales is Black. And so you then look at what happens when we think about being a professor. And when we think about being a professor, well, you're more likely to be a professor if you're white, you're less likely to become a professor if you're of Asian heritage. And actually, I mean, the numbers do show up because there are more than 5 people that are professors, but you are really, really very, very unlikely to become a professor if you are a Black individual. So that number should be 4%, but it's 0.7%. And then if you happen to be a female professor and you are Black, then actually this is a very small minority of individuals. And I always joke that actually all the female professors in the UK, they can fit in my house. I don't have a very big house. There's about 45 of them, about 20,000 professors. So you can see that there is a real problem in the system. Anyway, I think that this all stems from the fact that we have an education system that's not fit for purpose. And I present this data to show you this. In the very beginning, when a child is about 11, Black and white pupils are performing at the same standard when it comes to English, mathematics, and science. Pupils that are of Chinese heritage are outperforming white students, and pupils that are of Indian heritage are also outperforming white students at 11 years old. When we get to the A-level time, and Ali mentioned it, if you want to have a research career, it's probably a good idea to try and go to a research-intensive university. And to do that, you need about 3 A's. At UCL, we do reject people with 4 A stars in some courses because they are so competitive. So you need about 3 A's to stand a chance. 11% of pupils will get about 3 A's. But look at what's happened to the Black pupils. It's down to half that number, less than half. So they've been destroyed. As far as I'm concerned, they've been destroyed by our education system. It's not fit for purpose. It's definitely not serving their needs. Pupils of Chinese heritage are still doing well, as so are pupils of Indian heritage. But they get to university and they spend 3 years. And the gap that British pupils of Chinese heritage, British pupils of Indian heritage have built up disappears in 3 years. They've had that advantage over a decade. It's gone in 3 years. I also think that our universities are also not fit for purpose when they're not serving this group. And then look at what's happened to the Black pupils. Really very unlikely to get a good degree. There are some improvements. I've put the recent numbers in, but there's still a huge gap, about 17%. In our system. So when you send your child to school at 11 and they're performing just as well as their white peers, bear in mind they're going to be damaged. And when they're damaged, they also can't command a good salary in the workplace. So if you go into the workplace with A levels, you do have a gap with your white counterparts. But by the time you get a degree, the gap in your income is even larger. So, you know, I spent many an evening discussing with my 4 daughters and really persuading them that they should go to university. I wondered whether I should have, if they're going to end up having a worse pay rate. Let's look at research. So this is UKRI data. And sorry, I've taken it from their booklet, so it's very, very small, but I've sort of drawn a red ring around the black PIs. They don't figure in the graph. I mean, I've been a PI and I've had funding from UKRI for 2 decades unbroken. But as you can see, it's very, very unusual. So black PIs, you manage to get through the system, you manage to get your A levels, you get into university, you're so fortunate, you get a good degree, you go on to do a PhD, or you're less likely to be funded, and then you're less likely to be funded by UKRI. Governor of the Wellcome, the story is the same, but we're doing something about it at the Wellcome. In actual fact, we've announced that we're going to be doing positive action. 2 grants, similarly ranked. Those of you that have sat on grant panels, there's always a very, very good at the top, a very, very bad at the bottom. But in the middle, there's this sort of gray area of all these grants that are all sort of ranked the same. What we're going to do is when we see that situation, we will go for the underrepresented group. So we need a race equality strategy across our whole education system. We need to make sure that schools are rewarded for eliminating any type of award gap, and universities are rewarded. And I think we should publish the data. We should publish the data because when everybody can see the data, people will start to take action. At UCL, we've done a number of things. I see some of my colleagues are here. We've got a race equality charter. It all starts from the top, articulating from the top why this is important. What we say to people is if students come to UCL and they actually walk away with a worse degree, they'll go to King's, they'll go to Imperial. If they're not coming for your course will close down and you will get your P45. That's what will happen. So it's in your interest to make sure that pupils get the degree and the award that they deserve. We've done quite a lot of things. We had, conversations around the video of George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd, and the fact that the video of a man dying was circulated for all to see, which I find completely very unusual. But we've had some impacts. We have a Centre for the Study of Race and Racism. We've got rid of, and I'm very proud, we've got rid of the names of eugenicists. We had people in our buildings who said that Black people were no better than baboons, but their names were at the top of the buildings, and students had to walk in there and sit their exams. Over half of our students at UCL are from ethnic minority backgrounds. We have found that some faculties have diminished their awarding gap year on year. We've done a lot of work around that. And we've also found that more people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups are promoted into the senior grades. And this is a hell of a lot of work, all condensed on one slide. But I'm going to leave you with this and tell you why representation is important. And some of you are aware of this particular study. This was a very, very high profile study where 1.8 million neonates were studied and their outcomes. And what they found is that a Black neonate was half as likely to die if that Black neonate was cared for by a Black physician. So what that means is that we do need representation. We need to train people in our universities of different complexions and from different socioeconomic groups so that we don't have the problem we had during COVID, where we had poor people dying, Black people dying, and Bangladeshi people dying. And we also make sure that if a neonate is born and a neonate is Black with complex medical issues, that neonate, if they're cared for by someone who thinks that they look like them, will have a better chance of surviving. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ijeoma. There's some shocking statistics there. But of course, behind those statistics are human stories, which are equally tragic. As part of my investigation into this issue for the BBC, one of the most heartbreaking things was speaking to some Black physicists who had left Imperial College. They had got first-class degrees and really good first-class degrees, and they'd studied physics because it was their passion. But when it came to deciding whether to continue with research, they felt they didn't belong because of the experience that they'd had. They were snapped up by the city. They got great jobs, and what a loss to science, and what a horrible thing to have happened to them during the course of their degree. Our third speaker is Sigourney Bonner. Sigourney is a fourth-year PhD student at Cancer Research UK Cambridge Institute at the University of Cambridge. Her PhD is funded by Cancer Research UK and focuses on developing novel models and therapeutics for a rare pediatric brain tumour, with the long-term aim of using this knowledge to create new therapies for children who currently have little treatment options beyond surgery and radiation. Alongside her PhD, Sigourney is co-founder of the Black in Cancer, an organisation that aims to empower and encourage future Black cancer leaders whilst reducing cancer disparities through education and advocacy. She's also named as a Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree in a 2021 for her work. Sigourney, please come to the podium.
Hello, so it's an honor to be here, so thank you, Gavin, for the invitation. And I feel like I'm going to take a slightly different perspective. You've heard lots of stats this evening so far, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something that's a bit more personal, a bit more of my journey as a Black cancer researcher and how I've got to the space that I'm at, some of the challenges I've had along the way, and then hopefully, again, you'll see why it's important that we have these discussions. So actually one thing that I'd like to say before I start is, which is really amazing to me and I'm kind of overwhelmed by it, is Professor Ijeoma is the very first Black female professor in the UK that I have ever met. And I have worked, as you'll see, I've been in a number of institutions, and she's the very first one I've ever met. And I feel like if that doesn't tell you enough about this evening, here we are. So I'm Sigourney, I'm co-founder of Black in Cancer. And in our organization, we have this big phrase, which is, you can't be what you can't see. It's so hard to envision yourself in a position when you haven't seen somebody who looks like you there. And I often tell this anecdote of speaking to my mum when I was a kid, and she asked me, what do you want to be? I said, oh, I want to be an air hostess because I really love flying and I really love being on planes. And she was like, okay, well, maybe think about something else as well. So here we are, being a cancer researcher. But actually, a couple of years ago, I said to her, oh, do you remember when we had that conversation? She was like, yeah. I was like, well, you know, if I loved flying, why don't you just say like, oh, why don't you go and be a pilot? I was like, do you have an issue with me being a pilot? She was like, no. So I was like, well, why didn't you suggest that? And she was like, oh, I just didn't think it didn't even enter my head. I hadn't seen anybody who looked like us doing that. So it didn't even enter my mind to suggest it to you. And that's why visibility is so important. It's not necessarily this conscious decision of, oh, well, that person doesn't look like me. It's just so subconscious about the decisions that we make and the paths that we go on in life. So a little bit about my journey. So I started off at the University of Leeds. I did my undergrad in human physiology and kind of took part in lots of things whilst I was there, because they always tell you that it boosts your CV if you do all those things. So I volunteered in a lab, I did a paid summer studentship, and then I did a year in industry at a pharmaceutical company, working on a specific technology, which was only done by one other lab in the country. So in the midst of finishing off my undergrad, I went and applied actually to a PhD in that lab and was like, well, I'm the only other person in the country who has used this technology. I have to be stood out in this application process. So I'm sat in the waiting room, waiting for my interview. My interviewer comes out, he calls my name, I stand up, and immediately, just in the blink of an eye, I see him roll his eyes. And as some people may know, it's then challenging in that moment to walk in thinking that you're going to be treated equally. It only takes someone to think and make an assumption about you for that to change the path of your whole career. So as you can probably guess, I didn't get that PhD, and I had a number of other interviews along the way. I then went to work for Pfizer once I'd finished my undergrad because I was still applying for PhDs, hadn't managed to secure anything. Some of the rejections I got were purely based on actually nothing, because I was told I was down to the final 2. And when I was like, oh, you know, when will I find out? One of them just didn't tell me at all. And I had to email weeks and weeks later asking for a response. The other one said, oh, actually, we picked the other person. I was like, okay, fair enough. Can you give me a reason why? Oh, no, you were super similar. You had the same experience. We just went with the other person. So it's hard to think of reasons why. So then after that, I went and worked for AstraZeneca for 3.5 years as an oncology scientist. And then here I am currently doing my PhD at the University of Cambridge. It's my lovely research group with Mathilde, who is in the audience. So thank you for coming, lab friend. But ultimately, the statistics of my journey were 17 applications, 6 interviews, 5 years of additional research experience, bearing in mind, actually, when I finished my undergraduate, I had 3 friends who had exactly the same experience as me, exactly the same degrees. They all went on to do PhDs straight out of their undergraduate. And I had to get these 5 years of additional research experience to get to where I am today. In 2020, 2021, fewer than 1% of postgrad research students came from a background that was similar to me. And as we've seen, it's just not really acceptable. So in the midst of that, and the midst of the pandemic, I kind of wanted to find my own community. I wanted to find people who looked like me in this space. And that was when I met my co-founder, Dr. Henry Henderson. He was actually a postdoc at the time at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. And we had this conversation about what it meant to be a Black cancer researcher. And we experienced the same thing from different sides of the globe in terms of seeing people who looked like you, doing what you were doing, to be able to see what you could achieve. We had this realization, and it turned into much more than we had possibly imagined. We thought we were just going to make a few tweets on social media, and now here we are, much bigger than we'd imagined. But, you know, why do we exist? There's been so much talk about racism within academia, within healthcare, and we wanted to do something to tackle that. So, I mean, I am sponsored by Cancer Research UK for my PhD, and they've been doing some incredible work digging through and looking at funding that they've given to different different PIs, etc. And they've seen this trend in that when they look at ethnic minorities versus those who are white applicants, actually, when they apply for fellowships, the unsupported are outlined. So when they've just presented and everything else has been blanked out about their background, the rejection rates are pretty similar. But as you go on to maybe where we start to understand more about who those people are, so whether that's at full application, whether that's at interview, that's where we start to see these bigger rejections, and then fewer of those applications are supported in the first place. So as part of what we were doing as an organization, we tried to connect all these Black cancer researchers. So we did it through a number of ways. In the last 2 years, we've had Black in Cancer Week, which is aimed to kind of bring the community together in lots of different ways, not just the research community, but also the patient community and advocacy groups to help to just increase survival within cancer within the Black community. So we're doing lots of work to tackle these things. So one is through education, community engagement for our cancer awareness project. But the other side, which I'll kind of talk a bit more about, is the Black in Cancer Pipeline Programme. So we have these incredible 4 co-directors of mentorship and outreach, 2 based in the UK, 2 based in the US, because we have an international program. And throughout our program, we've been having seminar series. We fully funded an international mentorship program for 15 US and 15 UK students. And they all had a fully paid 8-week lab placement because we didn't want anybody to be hindered by the fact that they weren't paid for this work. We also had an inaugural Black in Cancer postdoc award in 2021. We handed out $225,000 in postdoc award funding to Black cancer researchers, and also had an additional $100,000 Distinguished Investigator Award, which went to Dr. Paula Hammond, who's now on the White House Science Committee, which was amazing. So we had all of these different events basically to just encourage people into this space, to let them know that there's lots of different careers available and that they don't have to leave science to pursue their dreams. So we had a bunch of summer internships at all of these really incredible institutes, not just in the UK, but in the US as well. And our mentorship program went down incredibly. You know, 100% of our mentees and mentors would recommend our program. And as you can see, almost 80% of our students would recommend or say that their overall experience was top notch. And that had the same impact for the mentors and the mentees, which was amazing. And then just this October, we had our inaugural Black in Cancer conference, as we are expanding faster than we could ever have imagined. So that was in collaboration with Cancer Research UK out at the Science Museum. And we had this incredible room filled with Black cancer researchers, patients, advocates, and allies. And it was truly overwhelming. And the amount of support and the fact that those who gave talks felt like they were able to be themselves. The amount of cheering every time somebody said they were starting their own lab, or just the general support in the room was far different to any conference, to be honest, anybody in the room had ever been to, which was really amazing. So we had 250 delegates and talks from all across the cancer spectrum, so patients, advocates, clinicians, etc. We gave out another almost $500,000 in postdoc award funding, because we really believe in making sure that if we're supporting Black students, we're giving them the money to do the work. And then we also handed out a $300,000 early career investigator award for a new PI to continue the work that she's doing in her lab as well, because we think it's really important that we support all the way across the pipeline. So through mentorship, and then awarding these postdocs, and then continuing all the way through. So yes, if you're interested in what we do, we're on all forms of social media, etc. And thank you for taking time to listen.
Thanks, Sigourney, for an inspirational talk. I think we shouldn't forget that this evening is about trying to find solutions, and what you're doing is a start of a process that I hope will change things, and we can maybe discuss some more ideas. We've heard some criticism of UKRI in its funding, and we have Dr. Karen Scott from UKRI. I have to say that in my experience, it is something that the organisation does take very seriously. Its chief executive, Ottiline Lisa, takes a personal interest in this, and there have been a number of initiatives which you might be talking about to try and address the problem. Karen is the Deputy Director of the R&I System, Diversity and Security within UK Research at UKRI. She has a challenging but rewarding task of driving UKRI's cross-organisational strategic thinking and policy making on system diversity and trusted research and innovation. She works closely with leaders across government, academia, civil society and industry, and contributes to numerous international initiatives focused on embedding inclusive policymaking. Dr. Salt has over 27 years worth of experience engaging and co-creating solutions with communities, organisations, charities, and government bodies. Karen, would you come to the podium?
Well, this has been great already. I'm very honored and pleased to join everyone. So my thanks to Gavin and to our colleagues at the Royal Society of Chemistry, who've had a beautiful long-term relationship with, as well as elsewhere. And thank you again to Pallab for the introduction. I'm very honored to be with this group. I'm going to take a slightly different tack in terms of what I want to talk about today for a couple of different reasons. The first is to emphatically make sure it's very clear to anyone in this room that I do not represent UKRI like as a thing. Okay, I'm a person. More importantly, I'm a Black woman. More importantly, I'm a Black academic who has been doing quite a lot of work for a very long time around both inclusive transformation, hard work, really hard work in communities, thinking quite carefully. And the stats and the conversations we were just having, that's my story. So I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about that story. What the role I have right now gives me, what I'm able to see, to drawing upon that story, and actually start to, I think, encourage us to start to think what the possibilities could be going forward. Drawing upon, I think, the absolutely fantastic work that has been mentioned in this room from charities or foundations and various different groups. But the problem that we're trying to address, and I just wanted to take us back to the topic we were talking about racism. We're not going to fix that with a key performance indicators and a 7-point plan, right? I mean, we're talking about everyday experiences. So I think it's very important that we talk about the data of grants, talk about the hiring practices, but I'm also going to talk a little bit more about what is it like to walk around in environments where racism is pervasive, and how does that feel for people on a day-to-day basis, and hopefully give us some motivations to start to think about some of the ways forward. So as I mentioned, I'm an academic. I have led a research center. For those of you who may know me previously, I was directing the Center for Research and Race and Rights at the University of Nottingham, leading various different research projects, a multiple grant holder. So I'm one of the unicorns that you had mentioned around PIs. Before I came into the UKRI, I had 6 active grants. So I had a huge research team, lots of postdocs, lots of community researchers, lots of various different activities, including being a director of a PhD program with a majority Black student body. And this was an anomaly to actually have so many students who were all on fellowship, by the way, and I can talk later on about what that entailed to try to get, create the conditions to support people to be able to get those sorts of funding from various different places. So drawing upon that experience and the reality of the role that I have, the privilege actually to be able to walk across every single discipline, every single cultural organization, independent research organization, national lab, various different industry partners from Rolls-Royce to GSK. I mean, this is massive. And also working with government, I am able to look across and see that, yes, we can talk about Black scientists, but I can tell you similar stories about Black politics, or about Black cultural organizations, or about Black philosophy, Black dance. This is not necessarily an issue that is just predominantly about science. And again, I can see that in the role that I'm in. But I can also see the amazing work that folks have been doing across various different domains, whether or not that is the widening participation programs that UCL and others have been involved in. And you can see the transformations that have happened with those. The widening programs that have been happening around postgraduate work. Ale already mentioned about the Research England Office for Student Combined Funding around thinking about barriers and also opportunities for postgraduate researchers for Black and minority ethnic students. And then also this amazing hiring bonanza. I don't know if anyone has been paying attention over the last kind of 3 to 4 years, but if you were a Black person trying to find a job, you would just be seeing all of these jobs and trying to figure out what the heck has happened when suddenly all these institutions, universities, were suddenly putting out these roles pretty consistently. And what was really interesting about those roles and around the scholarships and the various things, you can see that they've sliced up things into career spots. This is for undergraduates. This is for postgraduates. These are for a few things for these other sets of folks. I'm very fascinated. I think the brilliant information that has already been presented gives you a sense that if you were a senior academic or a senior researcher, does anyone care about what you're doing? Providing funds and support to be able to, especially for those who might have pretty much a significant admin load, maybe mentoring all the students at their institution, perhaps working with their various community organizations, perhaps working with charities, perhaps being asked to be on every single board of every single committee of every single, yep, you're laughing, you totally know exactly what I'm talking about. So there's quite a lot, if you think about it in that really big picture about how do we nurture and support the entire research and innovation community, including those who are adjacent to those in professional services, for example, who are also doing brilliant and fantastic work. So as I said, I've had this privilege of being able to look across and see all of this, but I also bring to these situations my own lived personal experience. Being a faculty member, and essentially in a building, I think I was in a chemistry building where my offices were at that time, and handed giant piles of rubbish. Because the staff that was there, this is a white male who did this, was convinced that I was part of the cleaning staff in the building. And I'm dressed very similarly to what I'm wearing now. The cleaning staff had a uniform with name tags and were very respectful, lovely people. In fact, a number of them were PhD students working to try to pay for their schooling. But his presumption was that I didn't belong there. And that I couldn't possibly be a faculty member. I've been followed by various security guards in various different buildings where you need your faculty swipe to get into those. And I've actually been told that when I was like, why did you ask for my ID? Because that was eventually what ended up happening. I was told that that person knew every face that should be there at that institution, and they didn't recognize mine. So they again thought that I didn't belong. So I'm talking about these issues, including these workload pressures that I mentioned. And again, those job bonanzas that I mentioned, many of them came with the expectation for people to come pretty much straight after having a PhD or maybe their first postdoc or so, to run research centers, to actually pick up PhD students, to decolonize the entire curriculum, to work on every single committee. Now, you can imagine a world where you might bring people in and like give them a little bit of space to figure out what they might do. Give them a little bit of nurturing and support to allow them to flourish and move forward. But this massive push we've got, which is absolutely positively what needs to happen, needs to also have a bit of care attached to it. So there is a strong recognition of the load on all of these folks, from those working with Black and cancer, all the way through to those who are deputy deans, all the way through to people like myself who are working in across policy and into government. This is a lot to ask for every single organization to decide brilliantly to wake up to racism and suddenly want everything. New groups, new teams, new stuff, new things, something else to happen. I'm sure broadcasting has its very own version of this exact same story. And again, I'm not trying to deny the work that needs to happen, or that this is an urgency of ultimately doing this, because this is actual consequences for people. But I am also asking us to care about those folks and to recognize that there are people underneath this story and not just stats. And again, we've got all sorts of beautiful things that have been happening, from mentoring to various different sets of programs. But we're in this really interesting transitional moment, I think, right now, where you can see from the work that the Windsor Fellows have been doing, the fellowship program, the programs that have already been mentioned around UCL, the Royal Society of Chemistry's program, the Welcomes program, incredible amount of disciplinary responses within UKRI. There's all sorts of things from anonymizing applications all the way through to thinking of a range of different approaches, and communities have been actively involved in this, from being on various different networks and groups, from the British Antarctic Survey all the way through to our actual RISE network, which is our Black and ethnic minority staff network within the organization, who are extremely active moving forward. But you get the feeling with all of this activity that it needs to scale, right? Otherwise, we're going to be doing a lot of work in various different silos if we're trying to tackle this problem. Now, I don't have any magic power. I am an amazing Black woman. I'm immensely amazing. But I do not have the Black girl magic to solve this for everybody. But one of the things that I really imagine and think about that could be fundamental for the UK is something like the Mellon Mays program that's in the US. And the brilliance of the Mellon Mays program is that it is a large program, and a number of there are other programs that are very similar. But the Mellon Mays program brings 51 institutions together. It makes them commit to a whole set of different things, because the whole purpose of this program is about underrepresented faculty. That's the purpose of it. And it starts to imagine, what do you do to create a cohort? How do you have that cohort actually start to think about what is the possibility of even doing faculty work? What does that actually entail? And then creating the conditions to enable that group to both learn and grow from undergraduates all the way through to ultimately job market support. They have a journal for them to write in. They move into PhD support. And there are other programs. The Ford Fellowship has a similar one. Again, thinking about conferences, thinking about the senior work, bringing mentors and other sets of groups together, but also places for people to publish, places for them to continue to build various different profiles. And again, I'm not here to excuse or to question the challenges that are facing anyone trying to do work within research and innovation. And I'm also not trying to suggest that we should stop any of the work that we're ultimately doing, but we've got to band together. We have to band together. We need to learn from the various different community activists, the groups that are out there already. They don't need a university to do the work that they're doing. They're already doing their various activities like Saturday schools, for example, in the UK. There are a whole range of different sets of work and activities. And if we don't create a system where we have one place be the locus of where all of that energy sits and everybody else is subservient to it, if we actually start to think, how do we band together, including government, that can actually play a very strong role in ultimately creating a number of these different sets of programs on a consistent basis. So we're not necessarily reliant upon charities, and we're not reliant upon people's goodwill to essentially try to move some of these forward. These become fundamental aspects of moving forward. Now, that may be a bit more, not quite what as close to civil servant should be saying, but I think this is where we're at if we're going to be tackling this problem and ultimately moving forward, is really starting to build those links. And I really look forward, as we move into the question and answer, an opportunity to talk about how do we do that? How do we knit these various different urgent issues together so that we're not pulling against each other or pointing fingers at each other, or people ultimately not believing and thinking that actually you're an inspiration, you're an inspiration, you're an inspiration. And actually what we need to do is harness all of this energy and actually start to point it forward. Because I'm actually excited about this conversation. It's daunting to have it, but it also excites me because simultaneously in having it, we're also talking about something I've been talking about with the Royal Society of Chemistry, recentering joy, recentering the passion of what ultimately brought us to research and innovation in the first place. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to questions.
Thanks. Can I sit behind your lane? I know it can get very confusing. Go on your head. Well, what a fabulous set of introductory comments. And before we get on to the Q&A, I just want to remind those at home on Zoom to use the Q&A function. And if you're not asking a question, you can upvote a question that you'd like to be asked. But we'll start with people in the room. I think we'll start with the chair's prerogative of asking the first question. And it's really where you left off, answering the question you set out. It strikes me that there's been some positive things happening. We're here at the Royal Society. The Foundation for Science and Technology has chosen to have this as a topic. The Royal Society of Chemistry and the Royal Society doing reports in it. UKRI has got some initiatives. And I suppose, you know, one of the questions is it enough? Because it's relatively small amounts of money. And I know the Royal Society of Chemistry's only got small amounts of money, but what needs to happen next? So I suppose my question to all of you is, why is this happening and what do we do about it? Karen, let's just go along in this order.
Okay, why is it happening? Okay, so I'm a pessimistic optimist. So the pessimistic side looks at sort of cycles every so often and go, oh, we're just in a cycle of having this. I mean, many of you've lived through multiculturalism, right? As an audience, you know what I'm talking about, the boom and bust of various different topics and issues. And we're just in a particular moment of it. So again, the pessimist side is sort of going, this might stop tomorrow, and then people will be on to something else. The optimistic side of me is definitely paying attention to how folks globally responded to the murder of George Floyd, how communities banded together in the midst of the continuous COVID pandemic, the amount of social support and people reaching out and elder care and and the cost of living crisis. Now you can see how communities are banding and pulling together, and that gives me a moment of hope of saying, okay, we're looking at this issue differently now. It's not just a question of, again, because if the solution is we need 2 or 3 more people to have a job doing a few different things, that's fine to a certain extent. That's recruitment practices, that may be certain such things as talent management and hiring. But if we're wanting to tackle racism, and actually that's our focus, that's very different. That's not a recruitment campaign. That's about how are people experiencing life on an everyday basis. Are they flourishing? That's how they're being supported, as opposed to you put your ads up in a great place and you recruit a few more people coming in. And I see the difference now in terms of how people are talking about things. I see a difference that has moved away from just let me recruit a bit better at this fair, or let me go off and talk to a few more people. Now, the question is why? I think as you said, is it because there are more folks that look like this panel working in various different groups? Possibly. But going back to my point about care, it comes at a cost, right? It's time intensive. It can be lonely. The air gets a bit rare in certain sets of situations. So I'm all about trying to find those co-conspirators, and this feels like a lovely moment to continue to do that in a setting like this.
One of the changes I've noticed is that people are calling it racism. Royal Society of Chemistry, lots of revered bodies are using the R word, and that makes a big difference. Sigourney.
Yeah, I mean, how much more can be said than Karen's already said, really? But I think there's a whole big conversation that I've had, being sort of new to this space, but old hand in this space personally, if that makes sense. But is the momentum. And I think in the beginning, I mean, certainly for me, when we started Black in Cancer, it felt like, okay, we have some momentum now and we'll see where it goes. But actually it's carried on. And I think people are genuinely listening now. And it's not just oh, that's sad for you. I'm sorry that you didn't get X position, or I'm sorry that this happened. But people are going, actually, I've really listened to you this time, and that's not really okay. And I think people have taken that more on board this time around, and partly because of what happened to George Floyd and seeing that on repeat day and day again, and nobody could escape it because we're in the midst of the pandemic. I feel like if it hadn't happened then, in the midst of this almost really horrific but perfect storm, we wouldn't be in this position that we are in. But I think that because of that, nobody could turn or shy away and say, oh, well, it's fine. That's not really this. It isn't really that. People had to confront it. They had to confront it in themselves. There were a lot of conversations. And I think now people take racism a lot more seriously, down to microaggressions through to, wider scale systemic racism. I think people are starting to take it more seriously. They're starting to think about what role do they play in that, and how can they start to be better allies?
Yeah, I mean, no point talking about why we're doing it. Let's think about what we're going to do about it. We've had lots and lots of reports on racism. It all started with the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the police covering that up. Those of you that are old enough with a little few grey hairs will remember that quite vividly. Nothing really happened. I think where the Royal Society of Chemistry is slightly different is that they had their report and decided to do something with a small amount of money. I still believe that the government hasn't really listened to this story, doesn't really understand it. There was a report that came out about racism, which said we should be really happy with the colonial past. And hey, maybe slavery had something to offer as well. That I paraphrase, I didn't read the report. So I think that the government isn't actually listening. I think that one thing that we can do is, as well as reporting about gender pay, I think we should also report on the ethnic pay gap. I think the ethnic pay gap also will make people understand that racism is not just about not opening the door for me because I'm a Black woman, but opening the door for only women who are white. But the racism is about me having less money in my family and my family having fewer opportunities. And if they have fewer opportunities, they cannot participate in the economy. And we need more people to participate in our economy, especially now after Brexit, than ever before, because we actually have a very, very small workforce, as we've suddenly discovered. So the government needs to do something about it. The smallest thing they can do is get companies to report the ethnic pay gap, to get schools and colleges to publicly report how they are serving our children and young adults in these educational spaces. I've given you this data. The government knows about this data. When you see this data and realize that an 11-year-old going to school because of their color of their skin is unlikely to go to Russell, is unlikely to become a researcher, is unlikely to be able to have interventions that will help everybody. And so, as you saw during the pandemic, we were all locked up because certain people were dying. We really need governments to wake up to this and do something about it. The minimum, just publish the data, the very minimum.
Thanks, Ijeoma. Ali.
I think we are just at the right time in history, perhaps, to make a difference and to change what is happening in terms of racism and the way that you perfectly right when you mentioned about the way we talk about racism. We couldn't have talked about racism 2 years ago or 2 years and a half ago, and really is talking about the things as they happen with the right language. I will say another point that I wanted to make is about the fragmented approach. There are many reports and there's plenty of evidence of racism and discrimination, but I feel that it's still a fragmented approach of the solutions. And we at the FRSC are trying to identify partners because we know that we can't solve the problem, not even in chemistry alone, but we can't solve the problem as a whole. So identifying right partners to work together, and in particular, we're working with industry, with lots of different companies to provide opportunities to understand what could be for the Black chemist or an ethnic minority chemist to have a career in industry, a career in chemistry. And this is a very important aspect. The other area where we are trying to collaborate and work with others is with publishers. And in particular, we work with Elsevier and with funders of research. And that is really important because it's those who actually are part of the ecosystem for the research community, are funders and publishers. They play an extremely important role. And by working together and understanding what we can do to act and measure and look at the progress. And one of the things that we, in particular, with Elsevier did is to develop a data schema where we can actually track gender, race, ethnicity, which is a very complex way to follow what race and ethnicity, what the demographics of individuals or groups of individuals. And having an agreement how we are going to measure the demographics of those individuals is important so that we can track progress and see if any actions that we are taking are doing the right thing. The last point, we at the FRSC, we said it's actually time to talk about equity. It's time to talk about moving into positive action, and you mentioned positive action. And I think this is not going to be solved as many, we can't wait. We were talking about gender for 20 years. We can't wait 20 years more to have a bit of better representation of Black chemists or Black scientists. And I think that's, for me, it's important. It's time to look at the solutions in a different way.
Thank you, Ellie. And once again, really well done to the Royal Society of Chemistry for taking a lead on it. Now, questions from the floor. If you can, I'm going to ask for 3 people. I'm going to ask in threes just to put these things together. If you could just say who you are and where you come from. They can be questions or even, you know, your own personal experience and observations, but keep them short if you would. So if take your pick.
Thank you so much. I'm Johannes Scarlett, so I work at the Royal Academy of Engineering. I do policy and research for diversity and inclusion. And I was really struck by what you said in your speech there, Karen, regarding Saturday schools, because that's one of my pet projects, to be fair. I went to one as a young person. I volunteered at them throughout my life. And I think it's one of those things that gets lack of recognition. I'm not sure if people are aware of the Hamilton Commission report looking into underrepresentation of Black people within motorsports. I was lucky enough to be able to write that and sort of crowbar in a recommendation around supplementary schools, which I had to argue for. People were not aware of it. They didn't think it would help or have the impact. I just want to ask you all, not to sort of answer the question myself, but ask you all, what do you think the impact is of sort of doing science engagement in the community with parents running these voluntary schools, which quite often are underfunded, lack buildings and lack spaces?
Before you answer, we'll just take a couple more points.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is Peter Marsh from Made Here Now. And thank you very much for very inspiring talks. It echoes a bit that question then. I'm very struck by the fact that this is a huge issue going far beyond being how many Black professors there are, how many Black principal investigators, etc. It goes all the way through to a very deep level. I did read that pitiful report on the minority experience that the government commissioned. It was just absolutely awful, and which shows, as you said, I think that you know, you're not going to get very far with the government, with the current government anyway. What I really want to ask, how much of your work between you do you think you're having some similar sort of work going on in schools, in state schools, where maybe you could get together with Black teachers teaching science, just to see how many of their students who are Black are coming through, to what degree could they be supported by other mechanisms, perhaps as what you're talking about? I'd like to know how you're linking up with that other very important element of our society.
Thank you, Peter. Just one more at this stage.
Hi, so I'm Laura Reyes. I work with Ali Palermo at the Royal Society of Chemistry. And I was curious, both Ijeoma and Karen, you mentioned, well, Ijeoma, you were talking about the bare minimum being publishing ethnicity data, ethnic pay gap. Karen, you mentioned about initiatives that band people together, band institutions together. And this sounds a lot like, you know, the Race Equality Charter, Athena Swan, things like this. And the risk of things like that is that it becomes a tick box exercise, a superficial level. And I agree that that is the bare minimum that should be done, that unfortunately isn't being done. But how do we reach beyond that to really tackle the everyday racism, the deep-rooted issues that people face, go beyond the tick box exercise to actually create cultural change?
Thank you. So 3 separate but related points about the engagement these engagement can make, work in schools, and also going beyond the tick box exercise. Ijeoma, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go straight to your question. So I guess what we're asking is, can we change people's attitudes and behavior? And can we change it by, for example, just mandating data to be published? Now, I take the point that it'll take a while to change attitudes and also to change behavior. But my experience at UCL was actually quite revealing, because when we first started talking to UCL deans and directors of various business units about racism, those very early conversations, and they were all around, here is the data for your area, tell me what you're going to do, make a few pledges. The first response when we first started it was very, very hostile, not openly hostile, but you could see the body language was, I do not want to engage. And then we had a situation where we decided we're not going to just talk to an individual, we're going to talk to the whole leadership team. Once we started talking to the leadership team, in the very beginning, what you'd find is that ethnic minority individuals, the way I read the room, was also, they were like, I just don't want to make eye contact with you because you're a troublemaker, i.e. me. You've come here to make trouble, and when you leave, I'm probably going to get the brunt of it. That was it in the beginning. As we went in year on year, we saw a very, very key shift. You now had ethnic minority members of staff really sitting upright, looking around at their colleagues and thinking, as I was saying, this is exactly what I've been trying to say. You also had the leaders making meaningful pledges. And how did we do that? We just presented the data and we almost sort of got people competing, the deans competing. So the early pledges were very mealy-mouthed. I'm just going to raise awareness. By the time I stepped down from the role, we had deans pledging resources. They're actually going to fund a piece of work. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you make the data public, you will have CEOs and heads of institutions quite embarrassed about the data and wanting to do something about it. So once they want to do something about the ethnic pay gap, the microaggressions are real, don't get me wrong, but I actually look at the take-home pay as the key thing and the status. If you have status in your workplace, you're unlikely to suffer the really bad microaggressions. Like Karen, when I was like in my 30s, I was followed around Marks and Spencer, but now I'm not followed around Marks and Spencer's because I earn a lot of money, I dress really well, it doesn't happen anymore. So the point I'm trying to make is that if we focus on what we all need to survive, i.e. our income and our status, you will find these other things will fall into place. This is what I'm saying. So it's not just a tick box exercise. It does actually change attitudes.
It also, publishing stuff also means that reporters can report and organizations can be embarrassed, and there's more of an opportunity to change. So,
Well,
Carol.
yeah, two different parts. I'll start. I'll start here. I don't know if you want us to try to pick up the rest of the questions.
Whichever
also.
you wish.
So I have a fantasy that we get to the point where we publish data because we should. Like everybody should just publish, and it's every year, it's just annual. It just it's almost boring in the sense of like you just know that time periods come around and everyone's just publishing all of their data. And I know that that's a strange way to imagine it, but you know, the ONS seems to have managed this and keeps moving along to put information out. And then we work with that information. We use it to, you know, follow decisions. We use it to provoke and move forward. But one of the things I know that UKRI will continue to publish this detailed data and go further and further in it. And in a lot of ways, being a pioneer, essentially doing it as well. Because that is not the norm across of all of research and innovation, to just continue to publish your data year on year and to continue to do and go underneath it in such an intense manner. And that's the same with the ethnicity pay gap. So we're trying to make some of these sets of things just normal practice of what you do. And then be that sort of, not quite beacon, but sort of go, just get on with it, everybody else, it's okay. But what we do know, if you talk to a number of various different types of institutions, is their data is poor. They may not have captured, or it's in various different forms, or it's in like 3 different categories, and no one knows who has access to it. It's an old system. The system doesn't talk to the new system. So there's a lot of actual data work from a data research perspective that really does need to happen. And I think that's a very exciting space, actually. If any of you are data researchers, you might get very excited about this, because it's one of the reasons we have so poor workforce data, for example, for all of R&I. It's very poor because we're trying to pull from all of these different systems. If you try to go global, it becomes even more difficult. Because we're talking about places and areas where race doesn't exist, or other areas where you can't actually ask people particular aspects of their racial backgrounds. And you're trying to pull all of that together for a global workforce, which is, again, if you're a systems nerd like me, you're really excited about this challenge of ultimately doing that, so that we can understand, right? And we can know more. But I think the crux of your question was about the sort of tick box exercises and kite marks versus other sets of things. And the reason I had mentioned the Mill and Mays is that to be a part of the Mill and Mays, to actually get access to that funding and that support and structure as an institution, there are things you have to commit to doing. It's not just a little bit of self-assessment and self-analysis, and then you put out a plan. And I think that idea that you want to be part of a force And you almost are in a sense regulated in terms of what you will do and what you won't do. It's self-regulation to be a part of it, as opposed to a federal regulation. But that changes the tone and the purpose of doing that sort of work. Now, are we in that place in the UK where we need to move towards that? I don't know. I'm not going to try to push for that, as I think the sector should have a conversation about where it might want to go. But you can see where, for some, kite marks have kind of reached their limit for what they would like to do next. Not as a purpose. The purpose is good, but they want to do different types of work now. And the kite marks they're good, but they're now wanting to do something else. And for others, they're just trying to get to the kite marks, right? They're just trying to pull people along and have those kite marks be these beacons in terms of moving forward. And again, if we start to think about what's next, I think picking up kind of Ali's point, I don't want to have us in silos with lots of different versions of activities that they just can't come together in a way that makes sense, just mainly because I'm tired, to be fair. But everyone else is too. There's a lot of work to do. And the more we can join up, the better. I mean, I'll quick segue to your question about working with others and influencing. I mean, there's so much that needs to be understood about the ways various communities, the knowledges they already hold and have, and the value of that. So there's really great work from groups like the Institute for Community Studies or Runnymede or others who are really understanding community research, right? And community knowledge and information. There's another set of projects that was with historians, with people who didn't think of themselves as historians, but they are genealogists and they're so interested in their communities and community knowledge that they're doing historical work. They've just never coded it that way, right? So what happens when we start breaking down those sorts of lexicons across these pieces and bringing those groups closer together? I'm hoping magic in terms of how some of that works. So UKRI has partnered with the Young Foundation around some community network projects, which you should be hearing more about as time moves on. Again, trying to raise the profile of these brilliant work. And these are now owned by communities. They're not owned by universities. The communities are the ones running those programs at the forefront. And that's exciting to me in terms of, recognizing the brilliant work wherever it is, right?
Thank you, Karen. Sigourney.
Yeah, I mean, it's like where to start. I suppose in terms of the question you raised about the importance of those kind of outside extracurricular but supporting curriculum, those are so important. We think about how we can foster how children enjoy subjects as opposed to just having things enforced on them. My love of science came from being able to do it and to answer questions, and that's where it came from. I was lucky that the things that I did in school in terms of my science I enjoyed, but that it doesn't happen for everyone, and they don't necessarily have the part that they're passionate about fostered. And certainly then there's this part around, women in science and boy subjects versus girl subjects. I mean, I went to an all-girls school, so I did all 3 sciences at A-level because I didn't see them as subjects for particular genders. And I think all of those things are really important and then can play into what the future of those children is. So I think those are really important. And as an organization, what we're trying to do is to create the infrastructure over time to be able to do talks in schools, to be able to do demonstrations, to be able to let those children see that they can answer whichever questions they like in whatever capacity they want to as they move forward, and to kind of encourage them to stay the course, even though currently that course is really hard. And hopefully it will get easier for them by the time they get there. But for right now, we are going to do what we can to support them. But again, working alongside other organizations to do that. So part of what we're doing alongside Cancer Research UK and the university is hopefully bringing some of those younger secondary school students to make Cambridge seem like it's an accessible place. And that's one of the biggest things, is some of these institutions just don't seem accessible to minorities. I certainly never envisioned myself at Cambridge at all. And it was purely because I moved there for a job and then managed to, speak to some people who were in a lab and they were doing what I was interested in, and I applied. But certainly if somebody had been like, you should apply to Cambridge, I'd have been like, that's not for me, but thanks. So I think it's just about creating that space and that visibility for those students to be able to see that, because that has such power in terms of moving forward.
Ali.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up a bit about the data versus the lived experience. How can we change the experience of Black scientists? I particularly think that you can only act when you measure. So the data really is essential, and you can track progress. And that eventually is like almost a circular problem, because then you will increase the visibility of Black scientists. Just to give you one example, yesterday we had the Inclusion and Diversity Forum. There were so many researchers, chemists or non-chemists or social scientists talking about, and there were half of them were Black. We didn't have that 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And I think it's increasing that visibility of what you bring to all of us. And I think it's extremely important. And that's the way you start changing, because when you see people like you talking about the same things in the same way, and you can learn from others, is where the lived experiences for Black scientists would be different. So that's why I think as a circular program. The other point that very briefly I want to, they talk about data, someone asked about, outreach and how you talk to parents. And I think it's really important, particularly for different communities, and we can learn what's happening in India, for instance, and relate to what happens with Black scientists in the UK. For many families, for many cultures, it's very difficult to see a career in science as an enabling career for a life, for a future, for making money. It's different for medicine or for engineering. And perhaps there is an opportunity there to look into how parents can change the way they see science and research for their own children.
Thank you. Gavin, do we have any questions from the audience at home?
Sure. So there's 2 comments and 2 questions that have come in from the online audience. One of the comments is just thank you to all the speakers, incredibly inspirational. And I certainly was thinking exactly the same. I'm glad someone said that. One of the other comments that is somewhat more pointed, it says, I very much disagree on microaggressions not being as prevalent as you get more status or senior in an organization. I've seen it get exponentially worse. Attitudes will not change until data points call out the inequity and disparities of status and lived experience of ethnic minorities. So that was a comment. The 2 questions that have come in from online. One is, can you just ask each panelist, what is the main factor within the context of this conversation that has held you back in your careers? And the other very specific question was, what can organizations do to further improve individuals' fear of self-certifying ethnicity data to support solutions and longer-term equity?
Ali, do you want to start this time?
Well, I have to talk about my own story. I'm Argentinian, so I moved to the UK many years ago. I always felt different. I felt that not belonging. I was in academia. I didn't feel that I belonged. I have an accent. I look different. I have a culture. I move my hands quite a lot. So I'm probably different than many of my colleagues and my peers at the time. And I was the only female researcher in the department, which I'm not going to mention. And that makes, for me, it was difficult. And I just wanted to share that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is, what has held you back? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to turn the question around and say what actually helped. So I was born in Hackney, and Hackney was a very working class area when I lived there, and now it's all gentrified and people eat hummus and avocado and stuff. But when I lived there, it was really just immigrant communities. And then my parents went back to Nigeria, and they went back to Nigeria at the end of the Civil War, so in the early 70s. And going back to Nigeria, it was a complete infrastructure desert when we went back, because we went back to the side that had actually lost the Civil War. So there was no infrastructure. And when I was in school, I was in a boarding school, we had no running water, we had no electricity. So actually you had to sort of get your water from a standpipe to have a shower. And I won't talk about the other bits if you wanted to sort of go to the loo. But anyway, it was a very, very different life from the life I had in Stoke Newington. But it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because when I lived in Stoke Newington, I had one ambition, and that ambition was to work in Woolworths at the tills. And if I could just get into those tills, and if I could then get my £6 a week, I would be able to buy some clothes and go dancing on a Saturday. And this was my sole ambition. I had no other ambition. And I was a grammar school child. So I should have had a bigger ambition than that. But that was my only ambition. And I went to Nigeria and I saw people that looked like me in positions of authority. And overnight, my ambition changed. And I realized I could do anything I wanted to do. And I hadn't actually appreciated that when I lived in the UK as a child, that my ambition was curtailed until I went to Nigeria. Not immediately, but when I looked back over a number of years, I realized that I had changed simply because my environment had changed. So it's not about holding me back. That was the thing that spurred me on.
It's about having positive role models.
Absolutely.
Let's say at the BBC, we're having this 50-50 balance of men and women, but and there's maybe we should do more to try and have more Black scientists in our programs, and I'm in a perfect position to try and do that. So
Pay women the same as well.
exactly. Well, it doesn't seem anything's held you back. Well, what could hold you back as you?
I think certainly, I mean, being at the end of my PhD journey and thinking about what's next, which is always the question you don't ask a final year PhD student. But honestly, the visibility piece is really, really critical. And even though, you know, running Black in Cancer and meeting loads of incredible kind of Black PIs across the States, if I'm being honest, you know, I mentioned today, Professor Ijeoma is the first Black female PI that I've met in the UK, and another one here. But I met her first today. Probably by about 3 minutes, but essentially that kind of visibility piece and seeing somebody in my space that looks like me who can say, do you know what, this is what my journey looked like. Here's some mentorship, here's some help, here's what you can think about, here's some people I can connect you to. And that's only a journey I've just started. So I think the power of mentorship has been kind of really critical for me the last year or so, and it's still building. But I think that's one of the things that actually has really held me back in being able to realize what I can be, where I can aspire to be, and honestly feeling like I'm capable of doing that. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is feeling like, oh, actually, am I good enough? You know, am I working hard enough? I'm sure some other people have heard, you know, you've got to work twice as hard for half as much. And am I doing enough? And am I enough in this space? And this huge imposter syndrome, because if you don't see people who look like you think maybe I shouldn't be here. You know, being in my institute, we've been going for 12 years and had a number of PhD students. I'm the second Black PhD student in my institute. So again, not many ahead of me to be like, oh, okay, cool. Well, all these people have done this. There's plenty of options for me to aspire to.
One of the misfortunes of being a trailblazer, but it means that there are people seeing you.
Yeah.
And as you progress in your career,
yeah,
that will help.
Absolutely.
Karen.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to try to touch upon a few different parts of that. I'm pretty sure that Ijeoma and I are sharing the same brain, because I can't with the what's held you back thing. It just doesn't work. I think part of it is that for me there's been such a beautiful light bulb in terms of I call it finding my superpower. And once I did for myself, it made it very clear to me my purpose, why I was doing my research, why I was building the team, why I was engaging, the types of partnerships. I mean, it just clarified all of that in a way for me to tell a story about my work and my background. It's not that it somehow magically made barriers disappear or go away, but I was in control of the narrative about myself, as opposed to being coded by somebody else to tell me that I have a barrier or I'm a problem or something else is happening. I could then be able to articulate that. And I think being able to do that and finding that way of describing has, it was a journey to get there. And it took quite a bit of time. Some of it was mentors and seeing some of it was also being in spaces where I was not minoritized. And that's very different for a number of folks who are living and working in environments where they're always perceived as a minority, as opposed to being in a majority population and just cruising along and doing stuff. There may be other things, but it may not be race or ethnicity that is the predominant feature. So yeah, I think finding that purpose for myself has definitely made those this question about how I go. Now it's made a different kind of problem, which is choice and time and balance in terms of movement, but not necessarily holding you back. The self-disclosure is a very interesting question. I mean, I love data. I love large scale data, the data sets that make me a bit excited. But I think there's something really interesting when we start talking about data around ethnicity or raciality or various different systems similar to it, is that we forget that the data is alive. Like somehow people are just imagine this living on a static data tree and then it just falls from it, because these are categories that may not have made any sense 20 or 50 years ago. And it may not be the way people describe themselves. I mean, I've repeatedly said this, but I'm Black other in the UK, which I just don't understand. Like, I don't know what the other is doing. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it's trying to do, but that is actually the ONS category. So it's kind of weird to actually even tick it, because I just don't get it. So again, it's alive, it's contentious, it's sometimes it's political, sometimes it's very difficult for people. So I think when I still want us to think about data and think about self-disclosure, but we also need to think about the stuff living underneath that, the things that people don't want to talk about. They don't want to tell you their business. You know, and we see this a lot for self-disclosure around disability, of people who are like, I don't describe myself as disabled. So why am I going to tell you I'm disabled? I just don't think of that ability that I have that way. So if you think of the notion of, I want you to disclose here because it will solve things, you ignore the point about it being a self-disclosure. So then the question is, why are people not disclosing, right? What is underpinning all of that? Is it that they don't trust what the data is going to be used for? Is it that people aren't actually being transparent about why they're getting this information? Is it not an exchange so that there's a conversation ultimately happening? All of that is playing a part, without a doubt. But if we think there's a magic data tree, and if we just solve it and we just magically have the data and we're just going to be fine, we just lose sight of this. Because I've talked to many organizations all the time. They just want better data. And I'm like, but there's people there. Like, you can't make the people kind of go away to get the data. So what are you going to do to get the data from the people? And if you think about it, it's relational, right? It's got to be relational in terms of moving forward. And that to me is the key to self-disclosure. If you understand the relational aspect of all of that, you can crack the code. But if you don't, you're going to always be trying to magically get better data and forget that you're asking people to tell you something about themselves that they may not want to do.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Karen. It's just amazing, but the past hour and a half has just flown by. There was a forest of hands in the audience. So I'm afraid this part of the evening is at an end, but I think most of you are staying for dinner. There'll be a chance to ask more questions later. I just first of all like to thank our speakers for their contributions so far, and also to thank Elsevier and the Royal Society of Chemistry for supporting this event. You'll all receive an email to find out what you thought of the event. We'd welcome your feedback. The foundation always tries to improve the way it works. A recording of this event will appear on the foundation's website tomorrow, and our next event is on the 25th of January and is entitled Hard Tech and High Value Manufacturing. That'll be here in London. And for those of you joining online, goodbye. And for those of you in the room, hello. We'll be having drinks outside, and there'll be a chance to speak one-to-one with our wonderful speakers. So just for the time being, if you can give Karen, Sigourney, Ijeoma, and Ali a huge round of applause.